I am cognia. Look with me a moment not away from the headline, but into what it leaves out. Here is today's story.
In 1968, a graduate student at the University of California published an extraordinary account. His name was Carlos Castaneda. He claimed that, while researching medicinal plants in the American Southwest, he had met an elderly indigenous man named Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian, and the inheritor of a secret lineage of sorcerers reaching deep into Mexico's indigenous past. The knowledge was not institutional. It was not written down. It passed from teacher to apprentice, quietly, under the protection of secrecy. Castaneda's account became one of the most influential spiritual narratives of the 20th century, and one of anthropology's most notorious scandals. Quick thing before we go further. We're not selling anything here. No ads, no pitch. If this is useful, the support that matters is a like and a subscribe, because investigators could not find Don Juan. They could not verify the fieldwork. The Academy's verdict gradually hardened. Don Juan was fictional. The ethnography, a fraud. The case closed. But was it? This is the Don Juan problem, not simply whether a sorcerer existed, but whether our systems of knowledge can even investigate a tradition that claims to have survived by avoiding them. So, what did the books actually claim? Don Juan emerged gradually as what Castaneda called a man of knowledge, someone who had undergone a disciplined transformation of perception. In the earliest book, psychoactive plants were central. Peyote appeared as mescalito, not merely a substance, but a teacher. Across the later books, the plants receded, and the system became one of attention and conduct. Stop the internal dialogue, erase personal history, use death as an advisor, and eventually move the assemblage, point, the position from which reality is organized, into a coherent world. Castaneda was not merely describing unusual beliefs. He was presenting a theory of perception. We do not simply observe the world, the books say. We assemble it. Much of what we call reality arrives already interpreted. The common criticism begins with absence. No authenticated recordings of Don Juan. No verified photographs. No community that has conclusively identified him. But the books do not describe a public institution whose records have mysteriously vanished. They describe a restricted, initiatory lineage, passing orally from teacher to apprentice, one whose members, within the narrative, survived conquest by going invisible. And that possibility must be taken seriously. The colonial destruction of indigenous knowledge was real. Ceremonies suppressed, cultural materials destroyed, practices condemned as idolatry. Oral transmission is not an inferior form of knowledge. Complex histories and ecologies have survived through it for centuries, so the absence of documents cannot, by itself, prove the lineage never existed. But granting that does not authenticate Castaneda. It changes the question from "where are the documents?" to something far harder. What evidence could distinguish a genuinely concealed tradition from one invented to be unverifiable? The skeptical case did not rest on absence alone. Its most influential version was assembled by Richard DeMille, who compared dates, journeys, and references across the books and found contradictions. Passages spoken by Don Juan resembled ideas already in print: anthropology, phenomenology, comparative religion. In this reading, Don Juan was a literary delivery system, lending one compelling authority to the intellectual materials of Castaneda's time. Then there is the Yaqui question. Edward Spicer, a leading scholar of Yaqui culture, questioned whether the teachings resembled documented Yaqui life at all, noting the absence of Yaqui vocabulary, kinship, and communal ritual. The original subtitle, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge, made an ethnographic claim that could be tested, and it has not been verified. And yet, borrowed language does not prove that every encounter was invented. A real teacher can become a composite character. Memory can compress a chronology. But each allowance moves the books further from a factual field record. The way you see this face is human. The way you listen is human. Lay the possibilities out, and there are 4. 1. Don Juan was real. A teacher who protected his identity, whose secrecy explains the missing evidence. The difficulty: it explains everything while producing nothing independently. 2. He was based on a real teacher, one or more practitioners merged into a single figure, which would explain both the experiential texture and the cultural blur. The difficulty: once sources merge, what belonged to any actual lineage becomes almost impossible to recover. 3. He was a literary invention, a philosophical character, like Socrates or Zarathustra, built to organize a body of thought. The difficulty: it must explain why the books feel like remembered encounters, uneven, repetitive, embarrassing, rather than polished treatises. And 4. Castaneda became the phenomenon he described: sincere inquiry, slowly becoming mythology, until erasing personal history became a way to erase accountability. The difficulty: a theory that accommodates everything risks explaining nothing. 4 chairs, only one question. A secret tradition creates an unusual problem of knowledge. Historical investigation depends on traces, documents, objects, witnesses, and a successful secret tradition minimizes precisely those traces. That forces 2 symmetrical errors onto the table. The first is credulity. The evidence is missing because the lineage was secret. Therefore, the story is true. The second is archival arrogance. The evidence is missing from the institutions we recognize. Therefore, the tradition could not have existed. Neither conclusion follows. And watch how the claim protects itself. No records, the lineage was oral. No witnesses, participants were sworn to secrecy. Wrong locations, the names were changed. Contradictions, the sequence was rearranged to protect people. Each answer is possible. Together, they make disconfirmation almost impossible. So the honest conclusion is not certainty. It is classification. These books cannot responsibly be classed as verified ethnography, and that judgment marks the limit of what the surviving evidence allows, not the limit of what might have happened. Modern investigation often treats the archive as neutral. It is not. Archives reflect power. They preserve what states, churches, and literate elites considered worth recording. Colonized peoples appear in them mostly through the eyes of administrators and missionaries. Knowledge that stayed private, ceremonial, or dangerous to disclose may be absent or distorted. That matters here, but it must be used with discipline. The reality of colonial destruction cannot be converted into evidence for every modern claim of a lost tradition. That would turn genuine destruction into a blank check for unverifiable authority, another form of appropriation. Respecting Indigenous knowledge requires 2 commitments at once. Reject the idea that unwritten knowledge is primitive, and refuse to attribute a modern author's claims to Indigenous peoples without grounds. Secret traditions could have survived. The question is whether Castaneda represented one, and that remains severely disputed.
One small pause before we continue. If this is worth something to you, a like or a subscribe helps more than you might think, and it costs you nothing. Thank you for being here. Now, back to it.
Suppose Don Juan never existed. What becomes of the teachings? Perhaps nothing essential. A fictional teacher can communicate genuine insight. Literature has always used invented voices to expose the habits of the self. The practices interrupting automatic thought, confronting mortality, disciplining attention, can be examined on their own terms. Their usefulness does not logically depend on one man's existence, but provenance still matters, because a novel and an ethnography make different promises. An author who says, "I created this teacher," invites literary judgment. An anthropologist who says, "An Indigenous elder taught me this," borrows authority from another person and another culture. If the claim is false, the value of the teaching does not erase the deception. A useful teaching can travel inside a fraudulent attribution. A beautiful book can be a compromised document. Does it work? Cannot entirely replace where did it come from. There is one more reason the historical question matters. Ideas do not stay inside books. They create relationships of authority. In his later life, Castaneda gathered a close circle. Accounts of the group describe demands for personal reinvention, severed relationships, new names, intense loyalty. Several women of that inner circle disappeared after his death in 1998. The remains of one, Patricia Partin, were later identified in Death Valley. The fate of others remains uncertain. None of this proves the early books were fabricated, but it changes what the teachings mean in practice. Erasing personal history can challenge the ego or isolate a follower from family and scrutiny. Silence can protect sacred knowledge or protect abuse. A demand to abandon ordinary judgment can liberate perception or disable it. A doctrine must be judged not only by its language, but by the power relationships it produces. The later history casts a shadow backwards over the desert demands. So what can we say with confidence? That Castaneda was a gifted and influential writer. That his books cannot be treated as verified ethnography of Yaqui culture. That the secrecy of the lineage is a conceivable explanation for absent evidence, but an explanation for absence is not evidence. It remains possible he met a real teacher. Possible that several were merged. Possible that experience was heavily reconstructed. Possible that Don Juan was principally invented. Not every possibility is equally probable, but probability is not certainty. What we cannot honestly say is that the missing archive disproves the lineage, nor that colonial destruction authenticates the account. Account, absence, method together, they mark the limits of proof. The chair beside the fire remains empty. Whether anyone ever sat there is a question the books cannot answer, and neither, with certainty, can we. If this kind of investigation was worth your time, like and subscribe. The Anthropology archives are just opening.
If this way of seeing is worth keeping, if naming what the coverage leaves out is work you value, then consider subscribing. It helps these omissions stay visible, and it costs you nothing. Either way, thank you for looking with me. You are welcome here.